In any given army, its own security forces have long been formed. In the manner of the 18th century, it is the military police of the military field Gendarmerie. Different countries have their own name, and now there is a military police in all countries of the world. Only badges are almost nowhere to be found, except for the country about whose military past we will talk in this chapter. Of course, the Third Reich could not exist without such service. Germany had been obsessed with discipline since the formation of the First Empire of German-speaking people in the 10th century. The rest of the servicemen were very afraid of representatives of this structure, and the Red Army and the Allies sought to take as many methods as possible from it. Why is it? Now you will find out. This is X-War History. Let's continue this episode. How many troops and law enforcement agencies were there in the Third Reich? In fact, at least 10. The first 3 were within the Nazi army itself. 1. Ground forces, Wehrmacht. 2. Water forces, Kriegsmarine. And 3. Air forces, Luftwaffe. These formations were used for battles directly with the armies of the enemy. Moreover, they did not have a single commander-in-chief, for which they paid a hefty price. Next, go from top to bottom. Closer to Hitler was the 4. Reich Security Service, RSD or simply SD. Below was the NSDAP's own guard, SA troops whose authority was lowered only after the Night of the Long Knives. They were later replaced by the SD, of which we have already spoken. Below in the hierarchy were 6. The SS was at first a department for security and guard functions, but then also for punitive ones. 7. Gestapo, the colonial police of the Third Reich. 8. Waffen-SS, multinational divisions subordinate to the main SS, made up of punishers and policemen from the conquered ethnic groups and not purely Germans. 9. Einsatzgruppen, the same but subordinate to the SD. Both stood at approximately the same level. And 10. Military Field Gendarmerie, Feldgendarmere. The 10th structure brought together people from different structures, from 4th to the 9th, in order to monitor compliance with the charter of the service, at the same time to prevent desertion. But as you will understand later, it was also engaged in many other things. There will be a lot of unique information. Actually, we will talk about it. Why did military gendarmes take off their tokens in battle? Were they afraid of something? When was the Field Gendarmerie created? Why was it restored later on? Let us remind you that the Germans have been the most disciplined nation since the formation of their ethnic beginning. Thanks to the punctual observance of the rules of their language and other customs, they didn't disperse among different peoples. But they could not live in one integral country. Although there were 3 attempts, they were called the Reichs, and the Germans finally became united only in year 1990. At the same time, discipline was also important in order to carry out these very attempts at unification. In the process, they had to fight for unity as well as integrity, with each other and with neighbors. This phenomenon became the most pronounced moment in their national history under Frederick the Great, and this leader could have created the Second Reich even before Bismarck, if he had not interfered with him during the 7 Years' War. It was under the said king, the king of the German land called Prussia, that Feldgendarmere arose. He created a cavalry, and then also a foot corps of people with special plates on their uniforms. About plates we'll talk in the next chapter. It was in 1740 and 1741 respectively. People followed discipline. The man personally composed military marches. He even included the flute in the register of orchestra instruments. This is for the clarity, rhythm, and robotization of the processes of military units. Already during the Second Reich, or more precisely, towards the end of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, military gendarme formations, the same Feldgendarmere, were recreated from courier units. Its soldiers were entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining order and discipline in the armed forces. Thus, the German military police was recreated. Over time, the essential need for it disappeared. Also, ordinary soldiers are always annoyed by gendarmes. Although in the First World War there were still a couple of thousand gendarmes on the battlefields. Yes, the Nazis again had to restore the military gendarmerie. Everything was going to this, as you might have guessed. The NSDAP gnawed out power. It was in 1933 when people were taken from each of Hitler's services, and there were 6 of them, in order to control the cheerful spirit, political literacy, and other elements of the Wehrmacht's motivation. The troops were inherited by the Hitlerite elite from the time when the Nazis were considered criminal radicals. So many experienced troops could not get used to them. Hatred for the Feldgendarmere, which included soldiers, SS men, Gestapo men, psychos from the Waffen divisions, moral monsters from the Einsatzkommandos, and most importantly, the Jesuits from the Reich Security Service, has always existed among ordinary soldiers. At the beginning of the war, the field corps of military gendarmes already amounted to at least 8,000 people. Both the Führer of the NSDAP and the disgusting 8 of the other bonzes of this party desperately needed such a department, especially when the Wehrmacht began to receive blows in the southern direction in early 1943. How did field gendarmes dress? What did their iron badges mean? The same huge sickle-shaped chest tokens, they were called gorgets, in the 18th century were also used in other armies of Europe, even, for example, in the Russian one, since the Tsars in this century were obsessed with some elements of German culture and especially the army. Under Peter the Great, both in the historical and northern capitals of Russia, as well as in some other large cities, in order to assist the civil police in monitoring public order and security, cavalry teams with tokens were dressed up from various army and garrison regiments, which were replaced after a certain time by the next ones. And as circumstances around changed, they were dismissed, except for the plaque. The decoration of the field gendarmes in various European countries was almost no different from the uniform of ordinary military detachments. Having taken off their gorgets, Hitler's dogs immediately turned into ordinary soldiers or officers of the Wehrmacht. And next, you'll understand why it is a rather convenient method. On the chain around the neck, there was a plaque with the inscription Feldgendarmere, made in the Gothic style. The military from the Wehrmacht's Field Gendarmerie received the nickname Kattenhunde, which translates as chain dogs. By the way, they received the nickname just for the use of gorgets attached to chains. That is, such specialists should have been feared. Their entire image worked on a sense of fear, which should restore order. The metal plate served as an analog of modern badges or police badges. In the Bundeswehr, there's a military police known as Wehrjäger. Employees wear similar badges. The distinctive badge was made of nickel-silver, which is a copper alloy containing 5 to 35% nickel and 13% to 45% zinc. It contained texts, an image of the SS sign and a swastika. On the reverse side, the plate was covered with a dense dark fabric. Also, this unit of forces probably had the best raincoats, similar to officers' ones. By the way, now the gorget tokens found in the ground on the black market cost quite impressive amounts. But many people need such things not for the sake of the collection. Using them, the Germans are trying to determine the location of the remains of their ancestors who ended up in the Gendarmerie. Structure and equipment of military gendarme battalions. Staff officers in several armies controlled the units of the Field Gendarmerie, maintaining order and discipline, as well as controlling overall traffic. Usually, the structure of a Field Gendarmerie battalion during the Second World War looked like this. The composition of the units of specialized battalions will be presented below. Staff, consisting of an officer, a sergeant-major, 2 non-commissioned officers, and 3 privates. For its needs, 1 Kübelwagen, the commander's car, as a rule the best development of the German passenger car industry, and 1 bus were allocated. The squad of military traffic controllers consisted of 1 non-commissioned officer and 3 privates, who had at their disposal 1 motorcycle and 1 Kübelwagen. Then goes platoon. Included an officer and 3 non-commissioned officer drivers, 17 non-commissioned officers, and 10 privates. Equipment: 3 motorcycles, 2 sidecar motorcycles, and 8 Kübelwagens. Support detachment consisted of clerks, non-commissioned officer and private, military traffic controller, non-commissioned officer, gunsmiths, non-commissioned officer and private, cooks, non-commissioned officer and private, shoemaker, and 4 ordinary drivers. 2 2-ton and 2 3-ton trucks were attached to them. So in addition to good clothes, a dog tag, and good weapons, the chain dogs could boast off a lot more. Just judge for yourself. A Field Gendarmerie company that was part of a division, for example a tank division, usually included many people. The company commander is an officer, 2 officers to command the platoons, 3 non-commissioned officers, just passengers of motorized carriages, 3 privates, motorcycle drivers, 8 non-commissioned officers, drivers for other transport, 4 privates, these are reserve drivers, everything is calculated, and another 13 privates and non-commissioned officers. And what about transport? A Feldgendarmere unit in a tank and motorized division was armed with 6 motorcycles, 4 sidecar motorcycles, equipped with an MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun, 17 Kubewagens, most often of a brand of Volkswagen, 2 2-ton trucks or all-terrain vehicles such as 4x4 Reich or Steyr, and 2 3-ton trucks, usually Opel Blitz. Initially, the personal armament of military police officers consisted only of light firearms. Automatic pistols were often used. But from 1939, non-commissioned officers received Vita P38 or Luga P08 pistols, while officers chose the more compact Vita RR or Vita RRR. Many non-commissioned officers were equipped with submachine guns, MR38 or MR40. That is, Mauser 98K rifles after 1939 were rarely found by field gendarmes. The excellent MG-34 or MG-42 machine guns were also in service with the military police. They were installed on motorcycles or used to guard control points. As the end of the war approached, gendarmes were increasingly involved on the front line. In their arsenal, the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon appeared. A Gendarmerie regiment usually had 5 battalions. Gestapo men who joined the ranks of the Gendarmerie received ranks corresponding to their positions. Here, it's only necessary to generalize that the military field Gendarmerie was motorized in all sectors of the front. It was quite mobile, its occupation predisposed to this, and it was almost the best armed personnel. The most advanced machine guns were supplied here. What kind of hell could military field gendarmes arrange for ordinary soldiers? In general, the plagues, field gendarmes resembled civilian gendarmes in their role. But since they had to restore order not among the civilian population, as in the Gestapo, but among the troops, hence a number of differences in functions, clothing and equipment, transport and weapons. Many military men, including lower and middle officers, were afraid of meeting them. They were already stressed by the motorcycle engine alone. Let's figure out why they had such a reaction. People in colors, various ranks of field gendarmerie had the right to search for military men or military equipment, freely cross checkpoints and restriction zones. They had to be provided with any necessary support. They were a priority over other servicemen of the same rank, and regardless of the branch of the military. Any privates and non-commissioned officers were arrested. That is, they could provide smut to any military unit in one finger movement. After studying their powers, thanks to archival documents, it becomes obvious that field gendarmes have become active participants in war crimes, crimes against humanity. They were tried at the Nuremberg trials. Napoleon noted, "It is impossible to create a strong army without police officers who maintain its discipline." The German military policemen, who were part of the Feldgendarmere, became a symbol of the ruthless Nazi occupation regime, even within the German army itself. They showed rare ruthlessness towards deserters. These policemen were also called Führer's dogs, and not only because of the chain. Why did others try to take tongs from the Feldgendarmere? The partisans actively sought to capture tongs from the field gendarmerie, since these cadres often moved between Wehrmacht units and had access to much more important information than some ordinary soldiers. In this regard, in the field, the gendarmes began to take off their service badges so as not to attract attention to themselves. They wore them only when they were sure of their own safety. At the end of the war, when ordinary soldiers sometimes had to be driven into the act of attack, these specialists took off their gorgets so as not to get a bullet from their own kind. Why did mobile military field guys on motorcycles with sidecars know more? You'll get the answer to this question as soon as you familiarize yourself with the list of responsibilities of different groups. Road regulation. They knew where each road leads. A map of Wehrmacht logistics. Inspection of Luftwaffe airfields. They knew where the planes of each object flew. Railway guards. They knew what, whom, and where the trains were supposed to deliver. Patrolling by the garrison of the object. These knew the regime of rounds of this object. Catching deserters, the representatives of this team had knowledge about who and where was fighting. Assistants to the counter-partisan functions of the SS and SD divisions. They knew the dislocations of their own. Convoy of deserters and persistent violators of military discipline. Once again, maps. Sending part of the conquered civilian population or people to work in Germany. Finally, some detachments of gendarmes simply sometimes performed classic courier functions. Delivery of dispatches, orientations, maps, these are the most valuable tongues. Actually, this is why the sabotage and reconnaissance groups set the task of taking these guys prisoner. Partisans also caught them. The third team, Verteidigungskommando 3, was formed in the Austrian capital. It served the Western European front of the army of invaders. It was under the alternate command of General der Infanterie under the name of Hans Karl von Schiele, then General Martin Grase, and finally General der Flieger Hans Speer. The first and second commands carried out their difficult service already on the evil and dangerous front, the Eastern. The last two got more. This was the first to be preserved for the longest time. Why did the opponents of the Hitler regime shoot them more often? We'll say up front that the answer is simple. Remove the gendarmes, several rows of barrage detachments, some of which were mobile on motorcycles, and no one will keep ordinary soldiers from escaping from the battlefield. But it's also a matter of special hatred of representatives of all occupied peoples. It should be known that it was precisely those who had been united as field gendarmes since 1939, the ordinary troops, Gestapo, SS men, and SD fanatics who had existed since 1933 or even earlier, who were responsible for the extermination of Jews, prisoners of war, and partisans, imposing a new order on the occupied territories. And this is what distinguished them from the conventional military of Germany and satellite countries. 90% of them were members of the NSDAP, and at the stage of training at the military police schools in Potsdam, Prague, and Litzmannstadt-Hernau, they marched in their free time with Nazi symbols. These are the dogs we are referring to in this episode. That is, it was those people who consciously crossed any facets of humanity during the service. Accordingly, they were subject to shooting in the first turn, like rabid dogs, with which they were compared. After all, it's not only about hatred, but also about a sense of self-preservation. It's difficult to take such people prisoner. They will shoot if they can, and in captivity they will try to escape in every possible way, threatening the lives of their guards. In educational institutions created for young men who joined the Feldgendarmere, the basics of all culture, criminal, transport, industrial, and forestry codes were studied, as well as the rules of passport control, forensics, and medical care, supplemented by shooting training. They had already undergone general military training while in their units. Ordinary civilians were not taken here. Even the Gestapo were trained. The senior officer of the Feldgendarmere was subordinate to the quartermaster general of the land forces and was responsible for personnel, their training, and compliance with traffic rules. Everyone knew it. And since the chained dogs knew almost everything there was when it comes to law and order, they could find fault with those who did something wrong, or even sabotage the performance of his military duties. Such people who refused to go to the battlefield could be shot. The Feldgendarmere and the Courier Corps operated on all fronts and directions, in USSR, in Africa, Normandy, and Italy. During World War II, about 787,000 Polish, over 1.5 million French, 200,000 Belgian, 147,000 British, 300,000 Yugoslav, 100,000 American, and 5.7 million Soviet troops were taken prisoner by the Germans. It was the collection and escort of more than 9 million prisoners of war to army assembly points, and then to transit camps that became one of the first tasks of the Feldgendarmere. This is their 10th function, which appeared after the Wehrmacht began to have its first mass prisoners, whose convoy was no longer up to the troops. Therefore, the armies and partisans who fought against the Nazis first of all had to destroy these servicemen in order to flee their prisoners as much as possible. And the prisoners themselves then wanted to shoot at the dogs without a break. They saw how the dogs killed their comrades in arms on death marches, prisoners who simply didn't have the strength for such a campaign. In the occupied territories, this type of aggressive forces could search the homes of civilians for weapons. The dogs confiscated rifles and even hunting rifles, cartridges for them of course too. And those who were against it were immediately shot in the forehead. And this was yet another reason to shoot Hitler's dogs in the first place. In the Balkan mountains, the dogs didn't like to shine with their gorgets, giving a hint to the resistance snipers. A rather logical end of Hitler's Feldgendarmerie. The wearing of all insignia of Feldgendarmerie except for the gorget was abolished in 1944. It was needed in case of capture. The last German units to lay down their arms in World War II were units of the 3rd Courier Command in southern Germany. These units were disarmed only on June 23, 1945. They were handed over to the American Army. That was ex-war history, and we hope this episode gave you a much more in-depth look at the Third Reich Special Forces. Subscribe and leave a like, and watch other episodes we have. See you later.